The security camera footage was crystal clear. Margaret Whitmore's BMW slamming into Jake's Honda at 2:47 p.m., but when she stepped out of her car, adjusted her pearls, and declared with ice-cold certainty, "This is your fault for parking illegally." Jake knew he wasn't just dealing with a fender bender. He was about to go to war with the most powerful woman in Willowbrook Estates, the HOA president, who'd destroyed lives with a smile. What Jake didn't know was that Margaret had been planning this moment for months, and the crash was just the beginning of her revenge. The impact jolted Jake Morrison from his afternoon nap on the couch. The sharp crack of metal against metal cutting through the Sunday stillness of Willowbrook Estates. His eyes snapped open, and for a moment he wondered if he dreamed it. Then he heard the car door slam. Jake rolled off the couch and peered through his living room blinds. His stomach dropped. His silver Honda Civic, parked legally in his own driveway, now sported a massive dent along the passenger side. A gleaming white BMW sat at an odd angle behind it, its front bumper crumpled, headlight shattered. And there, stepping out of the BMW like she owned the world, was Margaret Whitmore. Even from 30 feet away, Jake could see the calculation in her movements. She smoothed down her cream-colored blazer, adjusted her string of pearls, and pulled out her phone. Not to call insurance or the police, but to take photos. Strategic photos. Jake's hands trembled as he grabbed his keys and rushed outside. The August heat hit him like a wall, but the chill in Margaret's pale blue eyes was arctic. "Mrs. Whitmore," Jake called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Are you okay? What happened?" Margaret didn't look up from her phone. Click, click, click. Each photo captured from a different angle, each one seemingly designed to make Jake's perfectly parked car look like the villain. "I'm documenting your violation," she said, her voice carrying that familiar tone of absolute authority that had terrorized the neighborhood for 6 years. "Your vehicle is parked in clear violation of HOA regulations." Jake stared at her, speechless. His car sat squarely in his driveway, the same place he'd parked it every day for the past 3 years. The same driveway Margaret had tried to cite him for aesthetic violations twice before. "Mrs. Whitmore, you hit my car," Jake said, fighting. To keep his voice steady, "You backed into my car while it was parked in my own driveway." Margaret finally looked up, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun that seemed to stretch her face into permanent disapproval. At 62, she carried herself like a general reviewing troops, and her expression suggested she'd found them all lacking. "Your car is parked 2.3 inches beyond the approved setback line," she announced, consulting a small notebook she'd produced from her purse. Section 4.7.2 of the HOA handbook clearly states that no vehicle may extend beyond the designated parking area. "Your negligent parking created a hazardous condition." Jake's mouth fell open. "Are you seriously? My car is in my driveway. You hit me." "I was conducting my weekly compliance drive-through," Margaret continued, her voice never wavering from its measured bureaucratic tone. "When I turned onto Maple Street, your illegally positioned vehicle created a blind spot. The accident was entirely preventable had you followed community guidelines." The absurdity of it hit Jake like a physical blow. He looked at his car, then at hers, then at the clear evidence of impact. Margaret had been backing out of the Hendersons' driveway, across the street, when she'd somehow managed to reverse into his parked car. "Mrs. Whitmore," Jake said, his voice rising despite his efforts to stay calm, "there's no way you could have hit my car from the Hendersons' driveway unless you were backing up without looking. My car hasn't moved in 2 days." Margaret's lips curved into the thinnest possible smile. "Are you suggesting I'm lying, Mr. Morrison?" The question hung in the air like a threat. Jake knew exactly what she was doing. In the 3 years since, he'd moved to Willowbrook Estates. He'd watched Margaret Whitmore destroy the lives of anyone who dared challenge her authority. The Washingtons had been forced to sell their house after Margaret cited them for 17 different violations in a single month. The Patel family had received a lien against their property for painting their shutters the wrong shade of approved green. Mrs. Chen, an elderly widow, had been fined $3,000 for allowing her roses to grow 1.2 inches above the regulation height. Everyone in the neighborhood had a Margaret Whitmore story. Everyone had learned to keep their heads down, pay their fines, and hope she'd move on to the next target. But Jake had never been good at keeping his head down. "I'm suggesting you look at the evidence," Jake said, pulling out his own phone. "I'm calling the police." Margaret's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." "Why not?" "Because filing a false police report is a crime, Mr. Morrison. And when the officers arrive, they'll see exactly what I see: a vehicle parked in violation of community standards, creating a hazard. That resulted in an unavoidable accident." Jake's finger hovered over the emergency call button. Around them, the neighborhood was starting to take notice. Mrs. Patterson peeked out from behind her curtains. The Jenkins family had stopped their afternoon bike ride to stare. Even the Hendersons had emerged from their house, looking confused and concerned. "The violation fine is $500, Margaret continued, making a note in her little book. "The hazard. Citation is another $750. And since this is your third documented violation this year, we'll need to discuss the possibility of forced compliance measures." "Third violation." Jake's voice cracked with outrage. "You cited me for having my garbage cans visible from the street because I put them out 30 minutes early, and for having a package on my porch for more than 24 hours when I was out of town. Rules exist for a reason, Mr. Morrison. This is insane." Jake looked around at his neighbors, hoping for support, but most of them had already retreated behind their doors. Only the Hendersons remained, whispering to each other and occasionally glancing his way. Margaret followed his gaze and seemed to take satisfaction in his isolation. "I assume you have insurance." "Of course I have insurance, but good. They'll need to cover the damages to my vehicle. I estimate repairs will run approximately $8,000. She gestured to her barely scratched bumper as if it were totaled. Jake felt the world tilting around him. "You want me to pay for damages to your car after you hit mine?" "I want you to take responsibility for your actions," Margaret replied. "Your illegal parking created this situation. The responsible thing would be to make it right." "No," the word came out harder than Jake intended. "Absolutely not." Margaret's pencil stopped moving. She looked up at him with the kind of cold interest a scientist might show a particularly fascinating specimen. "Excuse me," I said. "No, I'm not paying for your repairs. I'm not paying your ridiculous fines, and I'm definitely calling the police." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Margaret closed her notebook with a sharp snap. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "I've been president of this HOA for 6 years. In that time, I've helped maintain property values, ensured community standards, and protected the investment of every homeowner in this neighborhood. I've also seen what happens to people who choose to be difficult." She stepped closer, and Jake caught a whiff of her perfume, something expensive and suffocating. "I tried to handle this the easy way," Margaret continued. "But if you insist on making this complicated, I'm prepared to be very thorough. By the time I'm finished, you'll wish you'd simply written the check." Jake's heart hammered against his ribs. Every instinct screamed at him to back down, to apologize, to do whatever it took to make this woman go away. But as he looked at his damaged car, at the neighbors hiding behind their curtains, at Margaret's cold, satisfied smile, something else rose up in his chest. Rage, pure, clean, righteous rage. "Do your worst," Jake said quietly. Margaret's smile widened. "I intend to." She turned on her heel and walked back to her BMW, her heels clicking against the asphalt with military precision. The engine started with a purr, and she backed out of his driveway as if nothing had happened. Jake stood alone in his driveway, phone in hand, staring at the damage to his car. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and sweat trickled down his back. Around him, the neighborhood had returned to its artificial peace, but Jake could feel the eyes watching from behind curtains and blinds. He looked down at his phone screen, the emergency call button still glowing. His thumb hovered over it, then he heard the sound of footsteps on pavement. "Excuse me," a voice called out. "Are you okay?" Jake turned to see Robert Henderson, walking toward him, his wife Sarah trailing behind. Robert was a tall, thin man in his 50s, with kind eyes and the permanently worried expression of someone who'd spent too many years working in middle management. "I'm fine," Jake said automatically, then gestured at his car. "Well, relatively speaking," Robert winced at the damage. "We saw the whole thing from our kitchen window. Margaret was backing out of our driveway when she hit you." Jake's head snapped up. "You saw it, clear as day," Sarah Henderson said, joining them. She was a small woman with graying hair, and the known-sense demeanor of a retired teacher. She was going way too fast. Officer Diana Martinez had been a cop for 12 years, and she'd seen every kind of insurance scam, neighbor dispute, and petty revenge plot imaginable. But as she walked up Jake Morrison's driveway, studying the damage to both vehicles, something felt off. The physics were all wrong. "So let me get this straight," Officer Martinez said, flipping through her notepad. "Mrs. Whitmore was backing out of the driveway across the street when she hit your car." Jake nodded, pointing to the Henderson house. "That's what the neighbors said they saw." Martinez walked the distance between the two driveways, her trained eye calculating angles and trajectories. For Margaret's BMW to hit Jake's Honda at that angle, she would have had to back out of the Henderson driveway across the street, and then somehow reverse direction to impact the passenger side of his car. "That doesn't make sense," Martinez muttered, then raised her voice. "Mr. Morrison, are you sure about the direction of impact?" Before Jake could answer, a door slammed with theatrical precision. Margaret Whitmore emerged from her house, having changed into a navy blue suit that screamed authority and respectability. She walked toward them with the measured pace of someone who owned the world. "Officer Margaret said," extending a perfectly manicured hand. "I'm Margaret Whitmore, president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I'm so glad you're here." Martinez shook her hand, noting the firm grip and steady eye contact. "Ma'am, I understand you were involved in this." "Accident? I'm afraid so," Margaret replied, her voice carrying just the right note of regret. "I was conducting my weekly compliance inspection when this unfortunate incident occurred." She gestured toward Jake's Honda with the air of someone pointing out a particularly offensive piece of trash. "As you can see, Mr. Morrison has parked his vehicle in direct violation of our community standards. The front bumper extends approximately 2.3 inches beyond the approved setback line." Martinez looked at the car, then at the driveway, then back at Margaret. "Ma'am, his car appears to be parked normally in his own driveway." "I have the measurements right here," Margaret said, producing a manila folder thick with documents. Along with photographic evidence of the violation, documented complaints from neighbors, and a complete history of Mr. Morrison's non-compliance with community standards. Jake's blood ran cold. What history? What complaints? Margaret opened the folder with practiced efficiency. 3 noise complaints filed in the past 6 months, 2 reports of unsightly vehicle storage, 1 complaint about unauthorized exterior modifications, and 17 separate violations of parking regulations. "That's impossible," Jake said, but his voice lacked conviction. Margaret's folder was thick, professional, and terrifyingly comprehensive. "I have photographs," Margaret continued, pulling out a stack of images. Mr. Morrison's vehicle parked 1.7 inches beyond the setback line on March 15th, his garbage cans visible from the street on April 3rd, his newspaper left on the driveway for more than the regulation for hours on May 22nd. Officer Martinez took the photos, and Jake's stomach dropped. They were all real. Every single violation Margaret had cited him for over the past year was documented, photographed, and time-stamped. "Ma'am," Martinez said carefully, "this is very thorough documentation, but I'm trying to understand how the accident occurred." Margaret's expression became pained, as if she were about to confess something shameful. "I'm afraid that's where Mr. Morrison's pattern of non-compliance becomes relevant. When I turned onto Maple Street for my weekly inspection, I noticed his vehicle was once again parked in violation of our standards." She pointed to a spot on the asphalt near Jake's driveway. "I pulled over here to document the violation, as is my responsibility as HOA president. While I was taking photographs, I noticed Mr. Morrison's car was actually rolling. Martinez raised an eyebrow. The vehicle wasn't properly secured. It was rolling backward down the driveway. Margaret's voice carried the perfect note of concerned authority. "I immediately put my car in reverse to get out of the way, but Mr. Morrison's vehicle struck mine before I could clear the area." Jake felt the world spinning around him. "That's not what happened. My car has been parked there for 2 days. The parking brake was on." "I'm afraid the evidence suggests otherwise," Margaret said sadly. "If you examine the point of impact, you'll see that the damage pattern is consistent with Mr. Morrison's vehicle being in motion at the time of collision." Officer Martinez walked around both cars again, this time more slowly. Jake watched her face, trying to read her expression. The damage to his Honda was along the passenger side, consistent with being hit by a reversing vehicle, but the damage to Margaret's BMW was on the front bumper, which would be impossible if she'd been backing up. Unless, ma'am, if you were backing up, the impact should be on your rear bumper. Margaret nodded gravely. I'm afraid that's where the situation becomes even more concerning. After the initial impact, Mr. Morrison's vehicle continued to roll. I was forced to drive forward to avoid a more serious collision. It was masterful. Every detail explained, every inconsistency accounted for. Jake realized he was witnessing a performance by someone who had been planning this moment for months. That's not true, Jake said, but his voice sounded weak even to his own ears. None of that is true. I understand this is distressing, Mr. Morrison, Margaret said with convincing sympathy, but I have a responsibility to the community. Your pattern of violations has created ongoing safety hazards, and now it's resulted in property damage. She turned to Officer Martinez. I've been trying to work with Mr. Morrison through our standard HOA procedures, but he's been uncooperative. This incident represents a clear escalation of his disregard for community standards. Martinez looked at Jake, and he could see the doubt in her eyes. Margaret's documentation was thorough, professional, and apparently legitimate. Jake had nothing but his word and a growing sense of panic. Officer Jake said desperately, the neighbors saw what happened. The Hendersons were watching from their window. I'd be happy to speak with any witnesses, Martinez said, making a note. Can you give me their address? Jake pointed to the Henderson house, but even as he did, he felt a sinking sensation. Robert and Sarah Henderson were nowhere to be seen, their windows dark, their car gone from the driveway. It appears they're not home, Margaret observed, but I'm sure they'll corroborate my account when they return. The Hendersons are excellent community members who understand the importance of accurate reporting. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Jake realized that Margaret wasn't just fighting him, she was fighting him with the full weight of the community's fear behind her. Mr. Morrison, Officer Martinez said, closing her notepad, I'm going to need to see your license and insurance. Information. I hate to add to an already difficult situation, but I'm afraid I'll need to file a formal complaint with the HOA board. Mr. Morrison's reckless behavior has resulted in property damage, and our community standards require immediate action. What kind of action? Martinez asked. Emergency compliance measures, Margaret replied. We have the authority to place liens on properties when safety violations result in damage to community members. I estimate the total cost of repairs, fines, and legal fees will be approximately $15,000. Jake's knees nearly buckled. $15,000. Repairs to my vehicle, property damage assessments, emergency compliance reviews, legal documentation, fees, and of course, the accumulated fines for your various violations. Margaret consulted her folder. The total comes to $14,847.63, to be precise. I don't have that kind of money, Jake said quietly. I understand, Margaret replied with fake sympathy. Fortunately, the HOA has established payment plans for situations like this, or, if you prefer, we can work with your mortgage company to arrange a property lien. Jake stared at her, finally understanding the full scope of what was happening. This wasn't about a car accident or even HOA violations. This was about power, control, and the systematic destruction of anyone who dared to challenge Margaret Whitmore's authority. Officer Martinez, Jake said, his voice shaking with rage, I want to file a complaint. This woman is trying to extort me. Margaret's expression didn't change, but Jake caught a flicker of something dangerous in her eyes. Mr. Morrison, I understand you're upset, but making false accusations against community officials is a serious matter. False accusations. Jake's voice rose. You're trying to charge me $15,000 for an accident you caused. I'm trying to hold you accountable for your actions, Margaret replied calmly, the same way I hold every resident of this community accountable. Officer Martinez looked between them, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Folks, this sounds like a civil matter. I can file an accident report, but the insurance companies will need to sort out fault determination. Of course, Margaret said graciously. Every move he made, Margaret seemed to be 3 steps ahead. But as he looked at her smug expression, at the thick folder of Jake's hands trembled as he knocked on the Hendersons' door. Through the frosted glass, He could see movement inside, but no one answered. He knocked again, harder this time. "Robert, Sarah, I know you're home. Please, I need your help." The door opened a crack, revealing Sarah Henderson's worried face. "Jake, I'm sorry, but we can't get involved." "Please," Jake said, his voice desperate. "I told the police you have security footage. If you don't have cameras, I'm going to look like a liar, and Margaret wins." Sarah's expression softened with sympathy, but she shook her head. "We got call 20 minutes ago. Margaret's already filed a complaint against us for unsightly pool equipment. She says we're in violation of 14 different regulations." Jake's heart sank. "She's retaliating because you witnessed the accident. We can't afford to fight her, Jake. I'm sorry." The door started to close, but Jake pressed his hand against it. "Wait, do you actually have cameras?" Sarah hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Robert installed a Ring doorbell last month after the break-ins on Elm Street." "Does it record the street?" "Yes, but Sarah, please. I'm not asking you to testify against her. I'm just asking you to let me see what actually happened." From inside the house, Robert's voice called out, "Who is it, honey?" "It's Jake Morrison," Sarah called back. "He wants to see our Ring footage." There was a long pause, then footsteps approaching the door. Robert appeared beside his wife, his face drawn with exhaustion and fear. "Jake, Margaret called us directly after the police left. She says if we provide you with anything, she'll make sure we lose our house." "She can't do that," Jake said. But even as he spoke, he wasn't sure. "She foreclosed on the Washingtons," Robert said quietly. "The Patels had to sell because they couldn't afford her fines. Mrs. Chen is working 2 jobs at 73 years old to pay off her violations." Jake felt sick. How does she have this much power? "She's been planning this for years," Sarah said, glancing nervously down the street toward Margaret's house. "She gets people elected to the city council, the zoning board, the municipal court. Half the judges in this county owe her favors." "But you have the footage," Jake pressed. "You could end this right now." Robert and Sarah exchanged a look that spoke of years of marriage and shared fear. Finally, Robert sighed. "We'll show you the footage," he said. "But we can't give it to you, and we can't testify about it. If Margaret finds out we even let you see it, we're finished." Jake nodded gratefully. "That's all I'm asking." The Hendersons' living room was modest but comfortable, filled with family photos and the kind of well-worn furniture that spoke of decades of contentment. Robert pulled out his laptop and opened the Ring app. "The camera activated at 2:46 p.m., he said, clicking through the interface. "Here's the footage." Jake leaned forward, his heart pounding. The video quality was surprisingly clear, showing a wide view of Maple Street from the Hendersons' front door. Jake's Honda was visible in his driveway, exactly where he'd parked. The timestamp showed 2 hours, 46 minutes, and 15 seconds p.m. There, Sarah pointed Margaret's car. The white BMW came into view from the right side of the screen, moving slowly down the street. Margaret was clearly visible behind the wheel, her phone pressed to her ear. She was talking animatedly, gesturing with her free hand. "She's on the phone," Jake said. "Watch," Robert said grimly. On screen, Margaret's BMW approached the intersection where Maple Street met Oak Avenue. Instead of continuing straight, she turned into the Hendersons' driveway, still talking on her phone. The car pulled up to the house, and Margaret sat there. For several seconds, still gesturing, then, without warning, Margaret put the car in reverse and backed out of the driveway at high speed. The BMW shot across the street in a diagonal line, straight toward Jake's parked Honda. The impact was violent and unmistakable. Margaret's car slammed into the side of Jake's Honda with enough force to rock both vehicles. The BMW's front end crumpled, and the Honda's passenger side buckled inward. But what happened next made Jake's blood run cold. Margaret got out of her car, looked around to make sure no one was watching, and walked calmly to Jake's Honda. She opened the driver's door, reached inside, and appeared to be manipulating something, the parking brake or the gear shift. Then she walked back to her BMW, pulled out her phone, and began taking pictures. Strategic pictures. The same pictures she'd shown Officer Martinez. "My God," Jake whispered. "She did this on purpose." "It gets worse," Sarah said quietly. Watching on screen, Margaret walked to several different positions around both cars, taking photos from each angle. Then she returned to her BMW and made a phone call. Even without audio, her body language was clear. She was reporting the accident. But she was also animated, gesturing and pointing, obviously spinning the story. The timestamp showed 2 hours, 47 minutes, and 32 seconds p.m. when Margaret ended her call and walked toward Jake's house, presumably to knock on the door. But Jake had been asleep, so she'd returned to her car to wait. At 2 hours, 52 minutes, and 18 seconds p.m., Jake emerged from his house. Margaret immediately got out of her car and began her performance. She planned this, Jake said, his voice thick with rage. She deliberately crashed into my car and then tampered with the evidence. It's insurance fraud, Robert said. It's probably criminal destruction of property, maybe even attempted extortion. Jake's mind raced. I need this footage. I need to show this to the police. We can't give it to you, Sarah said firmly. If Margaret finds out we provided evidence against her, she'll destroy us. Then what am I supposed to do? Jake's voice cracked with frustration. Let her get away with this. Robert closed the laptop. I'm sorry, Jake. I really am. But we have to protect our family. Jake understood, but it didn't make the situation any less devastating. He had proof of Margaret's crime, but he couldn't use it. She'd effectively neutralized the only witnesses to her fraud. Wait, Jake said suddenly. What if you didn't give me the footage? What if the police requested it as part of their investigation? They'd need a warrant, Robert said, and Margaret has friends in the police department. But Officer Martinez seemed fair, Jake pressed. What if she requested the footage directly? Sarah shook her head. Margaret will know it came from U.S. She'll retaliate either way. Jake felt the walls closing in around him. Every avenue seemed blocked, every potential solution thwarted by Margaret's web of influence and intimidation. Then his phone rang. Jake Morrison, he answered. Mr. Morrison, this is Officer Martinez. I've completed my initial report, and I wanted to follow up on that security footage you mentioned. Jake's heart leaped. Yes, officer. I'm actually at my neighbor's house right now, reviewing their camera system. Good. I'd like to see that footage as soon as possible. It could be crucial to determining fault in this accident. Jake looked at the Hendersons, who were both shaking their heads frantically. Officer, there might be a problem. My neighbors are concerned about retaliation from Mrs. Whitmore. Retaliation? She's apparently already filed complaints against them for helping me. There was a long pause. Mr. Morrison, are you suggesting that Mrs. Whitmore is intimidating witnesses? I'm suggesting that she has a pattern of retaliating against anyone who challenges her authority. That's a serious accusation. Do you have evidence to support it? Jake looked at the Hendersons again. Sarah was crying quietly, and Robert looked like he might throw up, but they both nodded slowly. Officer Martinez, Jake said carefully, I think you should speak with my neighbors directly. They might have information relevant to your investigation. I'll be right there. After Jake hung up, the three of them sat in silence. Finally, Robert spoke. This is it, isn't it? Once we show her that footage, there's no going back. Margaret will come after us with everything she has, Sarah added. But she's already coming after you, Jake pointed out. She filed complaints against you just for being witnesses. At least this way, you have a chance to fight back. What if the footage isn't enough? Robert asked. What if she has judges in her pocket? What if she's too connected to prosecute? Jake didn't have an answer. The truth was, he didn't know how deep Margaret's influence went, or how far she was willing to go to protect herself. But he did know one thing. If they didn't fight back now, Margaret would continue to terrorize the neighborhood indefinitely. Look, Jake said, I'm not asking you to do this for me. I'm asking you to do it for everyone she's hurt. For the Washingtons, for the Patels, for Mrs. Chen, for every family that's been afraid to park their car wrong or leave their garbage cans out too long. Sarah wiped her eyes. What if we lose our house? What if you do nothing and lose it anyway? Jake countered. She's already targeting you. At least this way, you have a chance to expose her. The doorbell rang, making all three of them jump. Through the frosted glass, they could see Officer Martinez's silhouette. This is it, Robert said, standing up. Once we show her that footage, we're at war with Margaret Whitmore. We're already at war, Jake said. We just didn't know it. Robert opened the door, and Officer Martinez stepped inside. She looked around the modest living room, then at the three worried faces staring back at her. "I understand you have security footage of the accident," she said. Robert nodded and reopened his laptop. "Officer, before I show you this, I need you to understand something. Margaret Whitmore has been seized." Officer Martinez opened the door with her badge, clearly visible, her stance professional but ready. Margaret Whitmore stood on the threshold, her perfectly styled appearance now slightly disheveled, her eyes blazing with barely controlled fury. "Mrs. Whitmore," Martinez said calmly, "is there something I can help you with?" Margaret's gaze swept past the officer to lock onto Jake, Robert, and Sarah huddled in the living room. "I need to speak with my neighbors about a very serious matter. I'm afraid they're currently providing statements as part of an ongoing investigation," Martinez replied. "If you have information relevant to the accident this afternoon, I'd be happy to take your statement." Margaret's composure cracked further. "What kind of statements?" "The kind that involve video evidence of insurance fraud and witness intimidation," Martinez said, watching Margaret's reaction carefully. The change in Margaret's face was instantaneous. The mask of authority and control slipped away, revealing something raw and dangerous underneath. Her eyes darted between the officer and the three people behind her, calculating rapidly. "I see," Margaret said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You've made a very serious mistake, Officer Martinez. Have I? Do you know who I am? Do you know how many favors I'm owed in this town?" Margaret stepped closer, and Martinez instinctively shifted her weight. "I've been contributing to the Police Benevolent Association for 15 years. I personally helped Chief Bradley get elected. Judge Morrison, no relation to this troublemaker, has been a guest at my dinner table." Martinez's expression didn't change. "Ma'am, are you attempting to influence a police investigation?" Margaret laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I'm trying to save you from making a career-ending mistake. Whatever lies these people have told you, whatever doctored footage they've shown you, I can make this all go away with one phone call. Is that a threat, Mrs. Whitmore?" "It's a reality check," Margaret snapped. "In 20 minutes, I can have your captain on the phone, demanding to know why you're harassing a respected community leader based on fabricated evidence from a known troublemaker." Jake stepped forward from behind Martinez. "Known troublemaker. You've been systematically targeting me for months." Margaret's attention swiveled to him like a predator focusing on prey. "Mr. Morrison, you have no idea what you've started, but you're about to find out exactly what happens to people who challenge me." "Are you threatening Mr. Morrison?" Martinez asked, pulling out her notepad. "I'm stating facts," Margaret replied. "Mr. Morrison has violated 17 different HOA regulations. His property is subject to immediate liens, totaling $47,000. His mortgage company will be notified of his noncompliance tomorrow morning." Jake's blood ran cold. $47,000. This morning you said 15. Margaret's smile was razor-sharp. "Costs have been accumulating while you've been wasting everyone's time with this ridiculous charade. Emergency compliance reviews, legal consultation fees, property damage, assessments, it all adds up very quickly. You can't just make up charges," Sarah Henderson said from behind Jake. Margaret turned her cold gaze on Sarah. "Mrs. Henderson, I wouldn't worry about Mr. Morrison's problems if I were you. You have much bigger concerns to deal with." "What's that supposed to mean?" Robert demanded. Margaret pulled out her phone and began scrolling through what appeared to be a lengthy document. "Let's see. Unauthorized structural modifications to your pool area. Improper storage of recreational equipment. Violation of noise ordinances. During your grandson's birthday party last month. Unapproved landscaping modifications. And this is interesting failure to properly register your home-based tutoring business with the HOA." Sarah went pale. "I tutor one child for 2 hours a week. Commercial activity conducted in a residential zone without proper permits," Margaret continued. "That's a $15,000 fine, plus immediate cessation of all business activities, plus potential legal action from the city for operating without a business license." "You're insane," Robert said, but his voice was shaking. "I'm thorough," Margaret corrected. "I've been documenting violations in this neighborhood for 6 years. Every resident, every property, every infraction. Did you think I became HOA president by accident? Did you think I maintained property values through wishful thinking?" Officer Martinez stepped between Margaret and the Hendersons. "Ma'am, I need you to step back. You're clearly attempting to intimidate these witnesses." Margaret laughed again, and this time it was genuinely amused. "Officer Martinez, you really don't understand how this works, do you? These people aren't witnesses, they're co-conspirators in a fraud scheme designed to extract money from my insurance company." "Excuse me, think about it," Margaret said, her confidence returning as she spun her web. "Mr. Morrison claims his car was parked legally, but I have documented evidence of 17 parking violations. The Hendersons conveniently have security. Footage that supposedly shows me deliberately crashing into his car. How convenient is that? And now they're all working together to file false police reports and make fraudulent insurance claims." Martinez frowned. "The footage clearly shows. The footage shows what they want you to see." Margaret interrupted. "But footage can be edited. Officer timestamps can be altered. Have you verified the authenticity of their video? Have you confirmed it hasn't been tampered with?" Jake felt the ground shifting beneath him again. Margaret was turning their evidence into proof of a conspiracy against her. "Furthermore," Margaret continued, "I have phone records showing that Mr. Morrison and the Hendersons have been in contact multiple times over the past month. They've been planning this insurance scam for weeks." "That's not true," Jake protested. "We barely know each other." Margaret pulled out another folder. "How many did she have?" "Phone records show 3 calls between your number and the Henderson residence in the past 2 weeks. Text messages discussing the Margaret problem and making her pay bank records, showing Mr. Morrison is $23,000 behind on his mortgage and facing foreclosure." Jake's mouth fell open. "How do you have my bank records? I have friends in many places, Mr. Morrison. The question is, how desperate were you to avoid losing your house? Desperate enough to orchestrate an insurance fraud scheme?" Officer Martinez looked at Jake with new suspicion. "Mr. Morrison, is it true that you're facing foreclosure?" Yes, but that has nothing to do with this, doesn't it?" Margaret pressed. "A man facing financial ruin suddenly becomes the victim of a convenient accident that could result in a substantial insurance payout. He just happens to have neighbors with security cameras who just happen to capture footage that supports his version of events. And these same neighbors just happen to be running an illegal business that I was about to shut down." Sarah Henderson started crying. "This is insane. We're not part of any conspiracy." "Then why," Margaret asked quietly, "did your husband visit Mr. Morrison's house at 11:30 p.m. last Tuesday night?" The silence in the room was deafening. Jake stared at Robert, who looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. Double quotes, Robert stammered. Jake's garbage disposal was broken. "I helped him fix it at 11:30 at night." Margaret's voice dripped with disbelief. "And you just happened to discuss your security camera system while you were there? You just happened to mention that it captures the street where this convenient accident would occur." Jake realized with growing horror that Margaret had been surveilling all of them. Every movement, every conversation, every interaction had been monitored and cataloged. "Officer Martinez," Margaret said, pulling out her phone. "I think you need to speak with your captain before this goes any further. I'm calling him now to discuss this fraudulent investigation." Martinez grabbed Margaret's wrist before she could dial. "Ma'am, you're not calling anyone. You're under arrest for insurance fraud, destruction of property, and intimidation of witnesses." Margaret's eyes went wide with shock. "You can't arrest me. Do you know who I am?" "Yes," Martinez said, pulling out her handcuffs. "You're someone who thought they were above the law." But as Martinez reached for Margaret's other hand, Margaret yanked away and backed toward the door. "This is the biggest mistake of your career, officer. By tomorrow morning, you'll be directing traffic in the worst neighborhood in the city. Margaret Whitmore, you're under arrest. Don't make this worse for yourself." Margaret's laugh was wild, now unhinged. "Worse? You think it can get worse? You have no idea what you've done. None of you do." She turned to Jake, her eyes blazing with pure hatred. "You wanted to go to war with me, Mr. Morrison? Congratulations, you've won. But victory has a price, and you're going to pay it for the rest of your life." "What's that supposed to mean?" Jake demanded. Margaret's smile was terrifying. "It means I'm not the only one with secrets in this neighborhood. It means when I go down, I'm taking everyone with me. The Washingtons, the Patels, Mrs. Chun, they all paid their fines because they had something to hide. And now everyone will know exactly what that was." She pulled a thick manila envelope from her purse and threw it at Jake's feet. Photographs scattered across the floor, dozens of them, showing various neighbors in compromising situations. Affairs, drug use, financial crimes, immigration violations. 6 years of insurance policies, Margaret said. 6 years of making sure everyone had something. 3 hours later, Willowbrook Estates looked like a crime scene from a television drama. Police cars lined Maple Street, their red and blue lights painting the perfect suburban facades in alternating waves of color. Yellow tape cordoned off Margaret's BMW and the area around her body, while forensics teams methodically documented every detail of the scene. Jake sat on his front steps, still in shock, watching the controlled chaos unfold. The manila envelope Margaret had thrown lay beside him, its contents scattered by the evening breeze. Photographs of his neighbor's people he'd waved to for 3 years, engaged in activities that would destroy their lives if made public. Detective Ray Castellanos approached, his weathered face grim. He was a 20-year veteran who'd seen every kind of human darkness, but even he seemed shaken by the scope of what they'd uncovered. Mr. Morrison, Castellanos said, settling onto the step beside Jake. "We need to talk about what we found in Mrs. Whitmore's house." Jake looked up from the photographs. "More blackmail material, enough to fill a small library," confirmed, filing cabinets full of documentation on every resident in this neighborhood. Financial records, medical information, employment history, family secrets, all obtained through illegal means. How did she get all of this? We're still investigating, but it appears she had a network of informants, people who owed her favors, people she'd helped get jobs or avoid legal troubles. She'd been building this operation for over a decade. Jake gestured to the scattered photographs. "What happens to all of this? Do these pictures become public record?" Castellanos was quiet for a moment. "That's complicated. The evidence of Mrs. Whitmore's crimes is part of the investigation, but the material she collected on residents, that's a different matter." "What do you mean?" "I mean, we have to decide what serves justice and what serves revenge," Castellanos said. "Mrs. Whitmore is dead. Her crimes died with her. But the people in those photos, they're still alive. They still have families, jobs, lives that could be destroyed." Jake picked up one of the scattered pictures. It showed Mr. Patterson from down the street embracing someone who wasn't his wife. Another showed Mrs. Chun's son smoking what was clearly marijuana in her backyard. A third captured the Hendersons' teenage daughter sneaking out of the house. At 2 a.m., she was keeping files on children, Jake said, his voice hollow. Teenagers making teenage mistakes, and she was documenting it all. "The deeper we dig, the worse it gets," Castellanos confirmed. "We found evidence that she was selling information to private investigators, insurance companies, even divorce attorneys. She'd turned the entire neighborhood into a profit center." A commotion across the street drew their attention. Robert and Sarah Henderson were standing in their driveway, arguing with a man in an expensive suit. Even from a distance, Jake could see the fear in their faces. "That would be Mrs. Whitmore's lawyer," Castellanos said, "Gerald Vance. He's claiming that all of Mrs. Whitmore's files are protected by attorney-client privilege. Can he do that? He's trying. He's also claiming that Mrs. Whitmore's estate has the right to collect on all outstanding HOA fines and violations. He's threatening to file liens against every property in the neighborhood." Jake felt sick. "So even dead, she's still destroying people's lives." "Maybe, but there's something else you need to know." Castellanos pulled out his own folder, much thinner than Margaret's, but somehow more ominous. "We found plans in her house. Detailed plans for expanding her operation to other neighborhoods. She wasn't just running one HOA, she was franchising. The model, what does that mean? It means Margaret Whitmore wasn't working alone. She had partners, investors, people who were funding her operation in exchange for a share of the profits. This wasn't just about power or control, it was about money. Millions of dollars in fines, liens, and forced property sales. Jake stared at the detective. "You're saying this was organized crime disguised as suburban governance?" "I'm saying we've opened a can of worms that goes way beyond one neighborhood," Castellanos replied, "and the people involved aren't going to be happy that their operation has been exposed." As if summoned by his words, a black sedan pulled up to the curb. 2 men in dark suits got out, their movements precise and purposeful. They surveyed the Crime scene with the detached professionalism of people accustomed to cleaning up messes. Friends of yours? Jake asked. Castellanos shook his head, his hand instinctively moving toward his weapon. I've never seen them before, but I don't like the way they're looking at this scene. The two men approached the police perimeter, flashing badges to the uniformed officers. One of them pointed toward Jake and Castellanos, and Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Detective Castellanos, the taller of the two men, called out, "Special Agent Torres, FBI, we need to speak with you about this investigation." Castellanos stood slowly. What's the Bureau's interest in a local HOA dispute? It stopped being local about an hour ago, Torres replied. When we ran Mrs. Whitmore's financials, we discovered connections to organizations in 12 different states. This is part of a much larger investigation. Jake stood as well, his mind racing. What kind of investigation? The kind that involves RICO charges, Torres said. Racketeering, money laundering, conspiracy to commit fraud on a massive scale. Mrs. Whitmore wasn't just running an HOA, she was running a criminal enterprise that was generating millions in illegal revenue. The second FBI agent, a woman with sharp eyes and graying hair, stepped forward. Mr. Morrison, I'm Agent Kim. We understand you're the complainant who started this investigation. I just wanted someone to pay for hitting my car, Jake said, weakly. Well, congratulations, Agent Kim said without humor. You've just helped expose one of the largest suburban crime syndicates in the country. Detective Castellanos looked between the federal agents and Jake. What does this mean for the neighborhood, for the residents? It means everyone who lives here is either a victim or a witness in a federal investigation, Torres replied, and it means this neighborhood is about to become very famous for all the wrong reasons. Jake felt the world spinning around him. What about the blackmail material, the photographs and files? Evidence in a federal case, Agent Kim said, which means it all becomes part of the public record once we go to trial. But these people, they're innocent, they were being victimized by Margaret. Some of them were, Torres agreed, but others were willing participants. We found evidence that several residents were paying Mrs. Whitmore to target their neighbors, divorce cases where one spouse hired her to manufacture violations against the other, property developers who paid her to force out longtime residents so they could buy cheap and flip expensive. Jake sank back onto his steps. How deep does this go? We're still finding out, Agent Kim said, but we've identified at least 30 neighborhoods across 12 states using the same model. Aggressive HOA enforcement funded by outside investors, with profits generated through fines, liens, and forced property sales. It's brilliant in a sick way, Torres added, who questions an HOA citation, who fights a $200 fine when fighting it costs $2,000 in legal fees. Most people just pay up and move on, never realizing they're feeding a criminal organization. A news van pulled up to the end of the street, followed by another, then another. Jake watched with growing dread as reporters began setting up cameras and interviewing neighbors. This is going to destroy the neighborhood, he said. The neighborhood was already destroyed, Agent Kim replied. You just helped expose it. Detective Castellanos gathered up the scattered photographs from the envelope. What happens to these people now, the ones in the pictures? That depends on what we find in the rest of our investigation, Torres said. Some of them are victims who deserve protection. Others might be accomplices who deserve prosecution. Our job is to figure out which is which. Jake looked around at the houses lining Maple Street, behind every perfect facade, behind every manicured lawn and regulation height. Hedge were people whose lives were about to be turned upside down. People who'd been living in fear for years, never realizing they were trapped in a criminal enterprise disguised as suburban paradise. Agent Torres Jake said, "What happens to me now? I'm the one who started this." Torres studied him for a long moment. That depends, Mr. Morrison. Are you willing to testify about what you witnessed here? Are you prepared to help us identify other neighborhoods that might be operating under the same model? And if I say yes, then you become a key witness in the biggest suburban crime investigation in FBI history, which means federal protection, relocation assistance, and a very long legal process. And if I say no, Agent Kim answered that one, then you become a person of interest in a racketeering investigation, because no one stumbles into something this big by accident. Jake realized he was trapped just as surely as every other resident of Willowbrook Estates had been trapped by Margaret Whitmore's system. The only difference was that his trap had federal agents instead of HOA violations. But as he looked at the crime scene, at the news vans, at the neighbors peering fearfully from their windows, Jake knew there was really only one choice. "I'll testify," he said. Agent Torres nodded approvingly. "Good. Pack a bag, Mr. Morrison. You won't be coming home for a while." 2 years later, Jake Morrison sat in a coffee shop in Portland, Oregon, watching the morning news on his laptop. The headline read, "Willowbrook Estates whistleblower testifies in landmark RICO trial." His face appeared on screen for a few seconds older, now grayer, with the hollow eyes of someone who'd seen too much. He closed the laptop and sipped his coffee, trying to ignore the familiar weight of anxiety in his chest. Federal protection had given him a new name, a new job, and a new life, but it couldn't give him peace. Every morning brought news of the ongoing trial, and every evening brought nightmares about Margaret Whitmore's final moments. The coffee shop door chimed, and Jake looked up to see a familiar face. Robert Henderson stood in the doorway, scanning the room until his eyes met Jake's. He looked older too, worn down by 2 years of legal proceedings and media attention. "Hello, Jake," Robert said, approaching the table. "Or should I call you Michael now?" Jake gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Jake's fine. How did you find me?" "Sarah's good with computers. Better than the FBI gives her credit for." "How are you holding up?" Robert laughed bitterly. "We lost the house 6 months ago. Sarah's tutoring business never recovered after the scandal broke. The media destroyed our reputation, along with everyone else's." Jake felt the familiar stab of guilt. "I'm sorry. I never meant for." "Don't," Robert cut him off. "You did the right thing. It just cost us everything." They sat in uncomfortable silence for a moment. Finally, Robert spoke again. "The jury's been deliberating for 3 days. Word is they're close to a verdict on the main charges, and the neighborhood gone. Most of the houses have been sold or foreclosed on. The ones still there are worth half what they were before the scandal." Mrs. Chen moved in with her daughter in California. The Patels went back to India. The WASHINGTONS ... No one knows where they went. Jake stared into his coffee. "What about Margaret's files? The blackmail material? Most of it got sealed by the judge after the defense argued it was irrelevant to the racketeering charges, but enough leaked out to destroy lives. 3 divorces, 2 suicides, and 1 family that just disappeared in the middle of the night." The weight of those words settled on Jake like a physical burden. 2 people had killed themselves because of secrets Margaret had collected and Jake had helped expose. He'd told himself he was fighting for justice, but justice had a body count. "There's something else," Robert said, pulling out his phone. "Something you need to see before the verdict comes in." He opened a news app and showed Jake an article. "Neighborhoods nationwide?" Jake's blood ran cold. 127. "The FBI's investigation keeps expanding. Every time they think they've found the end of it, they discover more neighborhoods, more victims, more co-conspirators. It's like a cancer that metastasized through the entire suburban justice system." Jake scrolled through the article, his heart sinking with every paragraph. Neighborhoods in Phoenix, Dallas, Atlanta, Denver, all operating under the same model Margaret had perfected. Aggressive enforcement, illegal surveillance, systematic blackmail, all funded by investors who saw suburban fear as a profitable commodity. "Look at this." Robert pointed to a section near the bottom of the article. "They estimate that over 50,000 families have been victims of these schemes. Total profits in the hundreds of millions of dollars." "Jesus," Jake whispered. "The best part, the syndicate's leaders are claiming Margaret went rogue. They're saying she exceeded her authority, that the operation was supposed to be legitimate property management, not criminal extortion. Do you believe that?" Robert's laugh was bitter. "I believe they're scared. The FBI has been making arrests across the country. Bank executives, judges, city council members, police chiefs. Margaret's little black book included contact information for corrupt officials in 12 states. Jake's phone buzzed with a news alert. "Breaking. Jury reaches verdict in Willowbrook Estates RICO trial." Both men stared at the notification for a moment. 2 years of investigation, testimony, and legal proceedings were about to culminate in a verdict that would determine whether Margaret Whitmore's empire would truly be dismantled, or if her partners would find a way to escape justice. "Whatever happens," Robert said quietly, "I want you to know that Sarah and I don't blame you. What you did was right, even if the consequences were terrible." "How can you say that? You lost everything because of me." "We lost everything because of Margaret. You just exposed what was already happening." Robert stood up and extended his hand. The truth was always going to come out eventually. At least this way, it might help other people. Jake shook his hand, feeling some small measure of the guilt lift from his shoulders. "What will you do now? Start over. Sarah's got a job offer in Seattle. We'll rebuild somewhere else, somewhere without HOA horror stories." Robert headed toward the door, then turned back. "Jake, when they asked you if it was worth it, what are you going to say?" Jake thought about Margaret Whitmore's final moments, about the neighbors who'd lost their homes, about the two people who'd taken their own lives rather than face the exposure of their secrets. Then he thought about the 50,000 families who'd been victimized by the syndicate, and the hundreds of thousands more who might have been trapped if the system had continued to spread. "I'm going to say it was necessary," Jake replied. "Whether it was worth it, I'm not sure we'll ever know." Robert nodded and left the coffee shop door chiming behind him. Jake's phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from Agent Kim. "Mr. Morrison," her voice was crisp and professional as always. "The jury's reached a verdict. All defendants found guilty on all counts. RICO charges, conspiracy, money laundering, fraud, everything." Jake felt a complex mix of relief and hollowness. What does that mean for the syndicate? It means we've cut off the head of the snake. The main operation is finished. But there are still affiliated groups operating independently. This verdict gives us the legal precedent to go after them systematically. And the people in those 127 neighborhoods, they'll be notified that they're potential victims in an ongoing investigation. Many of them will get their fines refunded. Some will receive compensation for illegal surveillance and harassment. It won't undo the damage, but it's something. Jake stared out the window at the Portland skyline, thinking about all those neighborhoods, where people were still living in fear, still paying bogus fines, still being terrorized by systems they didn't understand. Agent Kim, Jake said, "What happens now? Are you going after the other operations? One at a time? And we'll need witnesses like you for each case. People who were brave enough to stand up and fight back?" "Or stupid enough," Jake muttered. "Brave," Kim corrected firmly. "What you did took courage, Mr. Morrison, the kind of courage that changes systems instead of just surviving them." After the call ended, Jake sat alone in the coffee shop, processing the verdict and its implications. Margaret Whitmore was dead. Her co-conspirators were going to prison, and her victims would receive some measure of justice. But the cost had been enormously destroyed, communities shattered, trust obliterated. He opened his laptop and began typing an email to Agent Kim. "I'll testify in the other cases, however many it takes. If there are people still trapped in these systems, they deserve the same chance at freedom that Willowbrook Estates got, even if that freedom comes with a price." The truth is messy and painful, and sometimes destroys innocent people along with the guilty, but lies destroy more people over longer periods of time. Margaret Whitmore built her empire on the assumption that people would rather live with injustice than fight for truth. She was wrong about me, and hopefully she'll be wrong about others. Jake hit send and closed the laptop. Outside, Portland was waking up to another ordinary day, full of ordinary people living ordinary lives, free from the fear that had consumed Willowbrook Estates for 6 years. It wasn't a perfect victory. The innocent had suffered alongside the guilty, and the ripple effects of Margaret's crimes would continue for years. But somewhere in Phoenix, a family wouldn't lose their house to bogus fines. Somewhere in Dallas, a teenager's mistakes wouldn't be photographed and filed away for future blackmail. Somewhere in Atlanta, a neighborhood association would actually serve its community instead of terrorizing it. That had to be worth something. Jake picked up his coffee and walked outside into the morning light, carrying with him the weight of necessary truths and the hope that justice, however imperfect, was still possible in a world where people were willing to fight for it. Behind him, on the coffee shop television, the news was already moving on to the next story. But across the country, in 126 other neighborhoods, people were just beginning to realize that their long nightmare might finally be coming to an end. And sometimes, that's how justice works. Not with perfect endings, but with the slow, painful process of making things better than they were before, one difficult truth at a time.